Hello once again, everyone, and welcome to Stockton. I'm Dick Stockton. I hope you're having a great week, and I hope you're ready to meet one of the best in the sports play-by-play business and a truly class act. He's been behind the mic for 18 Stanley Cup Finals, has called 13 NHL All Star games, has called both men's and women's Olympic hockey games, and get this, in 2011 became the first NHL play-by-play announcer to win an Emmy for Outstanding Sports Personality Play-by-Play. It was a well-deserved honor, and he wasn't finished collecting hardware either, winning that same award these last 3 consecutive years, a fitting tribute to a guy who's now in his 34th year calling NHL games. Also in 2011, he became the first member of the media to be inducted into the United States Hockey Hall of Fame. I'm talking about the great Doc Emrick, Mike Doc Emrick. And if you don't know who he is, it's your loss. We're going to go beneath the foundation of this terrific broadcaster. He'll join in the conversation in a moment, and he's got some great stories as well. I've known him for eons, and he is one terrific guy. But before we get to Doc, I want to remind you that I want to hear from you and tell us what's on your mind, whatever it may be, by sending an email to info@stocktonpodcast.com. Once again, it's info@stocktonpodcast.com. We've been getting quite a few emails lately, and I want more because we're going to dedicate a future Taking Stock to answering some of those emails. Also, a reminder that you can reach me through our webpage that has all sorts of additional content, StocktonPodcast.com. Plus, there's always Facebook and Twitter at Stockton Pod. But what you really want to do is go to iTunes and subscribe to Stockton. It doesn't cost anything, and we won't be spamming you. It's just that if you register, you'll always get the very latest podcast delivered right to you as soon as it's posted. And while you're there, leave a review. Let us know what you think. Now, I mentioned taking stock, and in this episode, I'm going to share my thoughts on former Dallas Cowboy quarterback Tony Romo. You may know by now he's retired from the playing field, at least he says he has, and he's heading into the broadcasting booth for CBS. My opinion on that coming up a little bit later. But now, speaking of the broadcast booth, a play-by-play guy who's been at it for a long time for the NHL and other sports as well, and with the hockey playoffs in full swing, it seemed like a perfect time to talk with none other than the great Doc Emrick. How are you, my friend? Thanks for coming on once again.
Oh, no, I'm glad to do it.
You know, the first time I met Howard Cosell, I was working at KDKA, and I wanted to meet him because I really admired those shows he did at 8:25 in the morning, 5:25 in the afternoon, speaking of sports.
Yeah,
I remember those.
I used to listen to those, too.
So I went up to ABC to see him when I was in Pittsburgh, and I walked into his office, his cubicle, and he had dark glasses on, and he had a cigarette dangling from his lips, and he said, "Young man, I have no job for you." I said, "Howard, I have a job. I work in Pittsburgh, and I just wanted to talk to you and find out, about the way you come up with these great subjects and how you're a true journalist." Huh. Who cares whether Clemente can hit to right field, whether Mazeroski can turn the double play? I care about the Paris peace talks in an attempt to end this Vietnam War and the political conventions coming in. Who cares about sports?
Oh, dear. Well, that sounds like him. I was never around him, but I was around people that were. And I'll never forget Marty Glickman and I had lunches about every other month. When Marty retired, we would just talk about sportscasting and how much it had changed. He was an official coach of the Madison Square Garden Network announcers. Right. So we would have more than, legitimate reason to have lunch, but he would always find places on the Upper East Side to have lunch, which was always fun. And he was called after Howard died, and they wanted him to make some comment, and he said, "I think you should probably call somebody else." There were actually 3 people that he didn't want to talk about: Howard, Bill Stern, and Harry Wismer. And those were and he had great things to say about virtually everybody else, but about those three he wouldn't say anything. So I guess that was the way Marty was. He wasn't going to trash anybody. He was just going to not say anything. But I think he had more than his fill of those three guys.
Well, it's interesting that Howard, of course, was not that way, and would say things about anybody. And one time I happened to be with him when he was watching the Winter Olympics in 1980, and the first thing he said to me was, Kurt Gowdy, I thought he'd retire with a modicum of dignity, but there he is, watching the little sleds come down the hill. Doc, we're going to talk about Pittsburgh, of course.
Yeah, okay.
And, you and I were sports writers before we became sportscasters.
I guess that's true.
Yeah, you were a teacher as well, and you started in Pittsburgh.
In that area, yeah.
That's right. Well, Beaver Falls, and you were there when Namath, won the Super Bowl, right?
I was there just 1 year after. The afterglow was still shining from the downtown, which was, it was a different time because all the mills were working then. Right. So Beaver Falls was prosperous then.
I thought Pittsburgh was one of the friendliest cities I ever was in. Am I wrong?
Nope, you're right. I have a story about that, but I'll share it with you once we get going. If you want to talk about Pittsburgh and that part of it.
Yeah, we are, and we're going, and we're going to edit some of that earlier. Yeah, we're good. But this is not live, so no concern here.
Okay.
This is going. We're taping this. It's going to run in a few weeks from now, so the good stuff is going to stay in there. Okay.
Okay. Well, when I finished graduate work at Miami University, a master's degree, I was still trying to get into broadcasting hockey, and I had to get a job. And there was a job posting that I heard about at a little college in western Pennsylvania called Geneva in Beaver Falls. Beaver Falls was pretty much famous because Joe Willie Namath went to high school there, and he had, within the last 2 years, turned the National Football League on its ear by winning the Super Bowl over the Baltimore Colts. But it was pretty intriguing because it was 35 miles away from Pittsburgh, and in the back of my mind, I still wanted to get into broadcasting hockey, but I needed a job, and this one paid $7,000 a year, and I got to teach 2 classes of public speaking and 1 class of broadcasting, and then administer their 15-watt FM campus station. The stick was on a hill, and because of the hills around Beaver Falls and all around Pittsburgh, the carriage was really good for 15 watts. And at that time, when I moved to Beaver Falls, my high school principal, who was 70 years old when I graduated from high school, and by this time he was 74, very wise man who I always admired, he said, "You're going to love living in western Pennsylvania. Hill people take care of one another." And I found out he was right. They were the friendliest group of people that I've ever been around, and I always look forward to going back to Pittsburgh for any reason at all because of that. It's not that everybody else is unfriendly, it's just that the pace in other parts of the country is different, and there's still a priority in Pittsburgh. And I remember Ron Cook, who still has a sports talk show in Pittsburgh and still writes for the Post-Gazette. He and I were talking about it because there was an awful thing that happened at one of the schools in Pittsburgh about 2 years ago, and the Penguins held a moment of silence. And they got a moment of silence. And he said, "This is a good town. When you ask for a moment of silence, you get one." And there was another moment of silence this year for all of these awful things that happened in the country. And sure enough, it was quiet. And there was a moment of silence before a Pirates game on opening day. And they got a moment of silence. And and they sing the national anthem together at games. And, I really like the area. I like the people there. And, of course, my love for the baseball team is the primary reason that I had an affinity to Pittsburgh in the first place, because I was sold on the Pirates baseball team by a guy that you knew and I never met named Bob Prince. And I think that you owe the people that listen to this at least one Bob Prince story, because I can't tell any. All I was swung to be a Pirate fan, sitting in rural Indiana, cornfields all around me, dialing in 1020 KDKA at night, and listening to him and Jim Woods broadcast the Pirates games. So you're on.
Well, Bob Prince may have been the happiest guy I've ever met in our business. He got to play golf with Arnold Palmer, up at Latrobe. He covered golf he was just a joyful guy and loved doing the baseball. But a lot of times, Bob would get distracted. And I remember when I got to Pittsburgh in the late 60s, he was broadcasting a game on radio, on KDK radio, and the Houston Astros were in town. And so he would say, all right, there are 2 down here. And I don't do Prince well, but I'm just going to do a little bit, and here in the top of the 9th inning, attention, please. No, well, we're going to have a pinch hitter coming up for the Astros with 2 out, nobody on base. The Buccos lead 3-2, 1 out away from winning. And Frank Mungie has been announced will come up to bat here with 2 out. Mungie, then there'd be silence, obviously looking in the press guide. Well, no record of Mungie here, but they must have just brought him up, signed him, but no. Ball 1 outside to Frank Mungie, batting with 2 out here in the top of the 9th inning here at Forbes Field. Buccos leading 3-2. Mungie fouls it off. What? He'd go like this. What? Excuse me. That's Grady Hatton is the batter. The PA announcer said, attention, please, Frank Mungie, your engine is running in the parking lot.
Oh, I've never heard that one.
Oh, and he was great that way. He would make fun of the Mets. He'd say that. He says, ground ball, third base over to second, a double play. And the Mets are coming off the field. They're only 2 out. He says, oh, those hapless Mets, those happy they don't. What?
I think one thing that endeared Bob to me was he cheered for my team. And even though,
yes,
when you're doing a network broadcast, you can't be partial. When you're sitting there as a listener and you care about the team, you like the fact that the guy is cheering for your team. And he once referred to Maury Wills when he was not playing for Pittsburgh. This was in his Dodger days. He referred to Maury Wills as the pretty little Dodger shortstop, and you knew what he thought of him.
Yeah, he was great. He had the 2 expressions that I loved, and you remember these. They would win a game. It would be 4-3, and it'd be they finally get the last out. We had them all the way, right?
Yes.
We had them all the way, and if it were close play at first, he says, they got him by a gnat's eyelash.
That's true. It's far better to steal a good idea than originate a bad one. So in the glory years of the Devils, they used to have these Herculean comebacks. So in years that they were really good, they'd be down going into the 3rd period. At Madison Square Garden Network, of course, we were to be enthusiastic but impartial. And so instead of I would say at the end of the night, when it would be this improbable comeback, I would just steal from Bob and say, and they had him all the way. You borrow from people that you hear through the years, and frequently done that back through the years, and you sort of build an encyclopedia of your own. Some are original and some are not.
You are an original, though, Doc, and I tell you what, you make hockey a joy to watch and always have, and I know you go beyond, and I know that you're a humble guy, so you're not going to respond to this, but I think that you are the closest to Vince Scully, and I've studied play-by-play announcers in any sport that I have heard because of your vocabulary, your phraseology, the ease in calling a lightning fast sport. How did the style come about?
I think just through repetition and doing it over and over again, Dick. If you had the tape of my first game between Port Huron and Toledo at the Toledo Sports Arena, you wouldn't have been very impressed. And, as the years go on and you wind up in the major leagues, you see very few surprises because if, for example, Duncan Keith of the Blackhawks is behind his own net and he sees that Brent Seabrook, his defense partner, is open up the right wing boards and he wants to pass there, and he passes it there, chances are it's going to be tape to tape. Whereas in the low minor leagues, maybe it gets there, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's intercepted, there's a breakaway, and it's shot in the net. And so the predictability factor on how you call a game is much higher at the NHL level. And when you add several thousand games, it's getting close to 3,500 now. You wind up not having, I haven't had a perfect game yet. You don't have a mistake-free game, but there's a lot more that's predictable at the level that I'm working now, and especially with the best players in the world, than there was in the early years. So I think that part of it is that I'm doing the best level of this sport that there is. And I think the second thing, even though we all quibble, and the public has no interest in this, but we all quibble about the locations that we get in different places. I had a brief stint at what you did so well in football, and I always liked the Silver Dome because I thought you were nice and close at the 50-yard line. I didn't like the old sombrero or whatever it was called down in Tampa Bay because you were so far away.
The worst.
And a lot of times the Buccaneers jerseys were orange with white numbers, and they were very hard to pick up, or white with orange numbers. It was very difficult. So we all have those situations that occur in the sport of hockey. Some places you're closer than others. But by and large, NBC has been wonderful about getting positions. Even in arenas where the press box may be up high, they will wind up paying extra to get a lower location where they can set up just because they know that I can call the game better. The game at 20 rows back and about 25 feet up moves at just the right speed, whereas when you're 7 stories up and maybe 200 feet back, it moves much more slowly, and so the call winds up being more deliberate. I remember the old Madison Square Garden, before it was renovated to the tune of $3 billion, the renovation now has given us a wonderful location, but before, it was a perfect circle, the garden, and yet the rink was oblong, and we were at the very back at center ice of that circle. So we were a long way away, and the Rangers jerseys had a sleeve number that was 4 inches tall, and players don't show their backs to you. If they do, they're going to the minors. They show their sides to you. And so as a result, you've got 4 inches of material, and with the Rangers home jerseys, it was a 2-tone number. So the clarity of the number was buffered somewhat, and they do tend to move pretty fast. So it was difficult. So one day I paced it off, and I realized, and your younger listeners won't maybe have a reference to this, but in New York at Madison Square Garden, Bobby Thompson's home run in 1951 was hit a lesser distance and a lesser height than where we worked at Madison Square Garden to the visitors' bench. And I don't know how we did it, and I didn't cheat and look off the monitor because the game moves too fast, and the camera coverage, unlike other sports, cannot isolate and give you the good opportunity to anticipate where the passes are going. Whereas the time that I worked in football, I think it was much easier that way, and I think baseball would be as well. I had one brief stint at baseball. It was one game that I worked on MLB Network last year, and the discussion I had with Bob Costas, who's one of the geniuses of doing this baseball on television, was whether you watched the pitch come in looking down at the field or whether you watched the monitor. And I found it more comfortable to watch the field, even though in Pittsburgh it's the second highest broadcast booth in Major League Baseball, only Washington being higher. But the good thing was it was only a 3-inning performance for me. Bob let me do the top of the ninth because the Pirates were ahead of the Cubs, and it looked like they were going to win, and that was a nice handoff and a gift from him. But I may have made some mistakes in terms of where the ball came across the plate. But I think I could have been more accurate had I watched the monitor from center field with the pitch.
You know, that's fascinating about, and when, if you look at the monitor, I think a lot of times, and when I did baseball, I would look at the center field because I knew exactly where the pitch would be. Sometimes if you're behind and you're looking, you may not know low versus maybe some of the other places, but you have to really move pretty fast to get down to see the reality from center field to see what it is behind the plate. And,
right.
That's one of the things you learn based on experience. What is the most difficult aspect, before I get into how hockey came about for you and why you were enthralled with the sport, but what area and what part of the game, if any, says this is going to be a test for me now? What's the most difficult aspect to what happens on the ice?
I think depending on where you're located, it's picking up the numbers of the players. And again, because of how good they are, it is a spontaneous game, and you do get surprises and caroms of pucks off skates, like in Game 1 of the playoff series between Pittsburgh and Columbus. There was a carom that went off Phil Kessel's skate directly to the right, and the result was a goal very quickly. And Fortunately, it's television, so the eye of the person at home can follow it, and you try to name the players who are involved in the scoring play. So that is one of the challenges. Sometimes you do get bang-bang plays that are just too fast for the human voice to give it and the human ear and the human brain to take it in. But the eye can take it in really fast, and that's the fortunate thing about doing television as opposed to radio. But I think the main difficulty the challenge that you have sometimes is because players change on the fly, is being able to pick up those changes, and all of a sudden the guy that was on the right wing that had a right shot that was about the average height at 6'1" and 200 pounds is replaced by another guy that's 6'1" and 201 pounds. The first guy was 28, the second guy was 29, and we had players for the Minnesota North Stars named Steve Kristoff and Tom Younghans. One was 28, one was 29. They were right-side shots, and the only difference was about a quarter inch on the number that was 4 inches tall. And and they wore helmets, and that made it really difficult, and you had to take that extra step to see which one was which, and sometimes you were just wrong. I remember the first time we went in, I was telling you about Madison Square Garden. The first time that I ever went up to Madison Square Garden with Gene Hart, the legendary voice of the Flyers, I had just come in from the Flyers farm team in Portland, Maine, and had been there for 3 years. And so we're riding up in the car together for a preseason game, and I said, "So what's Madison Square Garden like?" And he said, "You're going to hate it, Doc." "Oh, why?" And he told me about how far away you were. And then he paused for a moment, and he said, "But the press room food's the best in the league."
That's good. You give up the food in a minute, I'm sure.
Yeah,
so.
Just to be able to see and do the job. But fortunately, Madison Square Garden is now one of the best, along with Bell Center in Montreal. And it is that criteria that I tend to have, 20 rows back and high. And you're basically just looking down on the ice, and you can see those sleeve numbers really well, and you can also see the play develop really well. So I guess that's kind of the essence of the type of game I do. It's not a safe call. You're not slightly behind, and you use a lot of words, perhaps more words than television requires, but I like to call the names of defensive players as well as offensive players, especially if they're taking an offensive player out or making a good defensive play. I think that's deserving of identifying the player, and so for that reason, I probably do more of that. So the law of averages goes up in terms of either having mistaken identification or having maybe two players that are making a play and maybe you only get one of them in.
I like more talk in television in hockey. I don't need it in basketball, and I don't need it in football, but I do need it in hockey, and I love it because especially the phraseology you use in describing, shots into the corner and digging out and all of those things, I think it really adds to the appeal of the game. What appealed to you originally about the sport?
I loved baseball, and I wanted to be a baseball announcer until I had pestered my parents to take me to a hockey game in Fort Wayne. So my brother and I and my parents went to a game on that night in December. And there was something about going into the arena the first time, hearing the organ playing, which they did a lot of back then, seeing the Zamboni go around the ice, and I couldn't understand why it didn't scrape up the red and blue lines and put those in the bin on top of the Zamboni too, but it didn't. There were plastic-coated wire fences around the boards, not plexiglass. The game was between Fort Wayne and Muskegon, Michigan, the Zephyrs and the Comets. It was rough. It went into overtime. There was a 10-minute overtime, and with 2 seconds left in the 10-minute overtime, there was a fight between the player coach for Muskegon, Moose Lalo, and the rugged defenseman for the Comets, Con Madigan. And of all things, talk about attitude. 2 seconds to go. Most guys would just say, well, that's it. We're done. And there was something that they realized that next game we might have to settle this. Let's settle it right now. So they had a fight at the end of the game, and by the time I got back to our station wagon, I was hooked. And I decided this is what I'd really like to do with my life, is to broadcast hockey. And then the question was how to do it, and it was all a matter of a lot of years spent. But I immediately, when I got into high school and had a little more credibility to walk up to somebody and ask them questions, hooked up with Bob Chase, who, until he passed away last fall, was the voice of the Comets that night in 1960 all the way through to the end of last season. And he gave me lots of advice, and I sat in the corner of the old Coliseum in Fort Wayne and tape-recorded games to myself. And until after I'd finished at Geneva and gotten to go to grad school at Bowling Green and really done games to an audience for the Bowling Green Falcons, I had never done a game to anyone other than myself. But it was those practice games that I think helped me at least get some of the rough edges off.
Yeah, it's a great story. And people, the reason why people call you Doc, of course, you got a PhD, right, in communications at Bowling Green State,
yes,
obviously.
After 2 years at Geneva, and one of those years, I became like you. I actually became a writer for free. I went to the editor of the Beaver County Times, which was a nightly, daily newspaper, and said, I'll cover the Pittsburgh Penguins for free if you get me a pass. He said, sounds like a good deal to me. So in the 70-71 season, Red Kelly, a great gentleman, was the coach of the team. Dick Stockton was covering the Pittsburgh Penguins on KDKA television and radio in the morning with Jack Bogut, Myron Cope, and all of those legends of Pittsburgh sports were around. Dick was the youngest one of the bunch, too. And so it was a great time up in the press box at that time, sitting at the end of the rink. They basically hid us up at the end in what was the most distant tier of the old Civic Arena. But I got in free, and I got to go into the locker rooms and meet players and meet coaches. And that really whetted my appetite for what came later. And after 2 years teaching at Geneva, I realized I could make $600 more a year if I had a doctorate. And if hockey didn't pan out, at least I could have that education and teach kids. So I applied to 2 schools that had doctorate programs and also had campus stations that carried the hockey games. And I was given an assistantship offer for both Michigan and Bowling Green, and I visited Bowling Green, and they had a campus station that did all 3 periods of the hockey games. A staff member did the first and third. A student did the second. And the staff member I met that day told me, I do the first and third, but the guy that did the second graduated. If you come here, you got the second period. I said, do you need an audition tape? He said, no. You do the second period. I've talked to you enough. I think you know something about hockey. You do the second period. So I made up my mind that day I'm going to Bowling Green. And after 2 years of coursework toward the doctorate, I sent out tapes again, and this time I had a legitimate air check. And a team in the minors in Port Huron, Michigan called, and for $160 a week I was in, and that was 44 years ago.
Isn't that amazing? We all have had those forks in the road, the stories, the things that disappointed us, that made us miserable, and the things that we are so grateful for. And you probably had no thought, as I never did, where is the path going to lead? You were happy doing what you're doing, or was it something you did think about? Where is it going to be down the line?
I think on some of those bus rides in the first couple of years in the IHL, of course, the first year you're so excited about being in hockey that the last thing you want to do is to get out of show business, right? You're the guy following the Elephants in the IHL, but you don't mind. You're just glad to be in. And then you start thinking, I wonder if this is ever going to lead to a higher league of a different classification. In Port Huron, we had a wonderful team, but we were on the verge of folding every year. It was a small community. The costs for operating a team were going up, and so every year there was the question about whether the Flags were going to be back the next year. And after 4 years, the Philadelphia Flyers were 1 year removed from being the Stanley Cup champions 2 years in a row, and they were putting their own farm team in Portland, Maine. And 40 people applied for the job of being the PR director and the broadcaster, and I was the lucky winner out of the 40. And that gave me a step up to the American League, which is like AAA baseball. It's just one step away from the NHL. And after 3 years there, the Flyers promoted from within, and that was my ticket to the NHL.
You have tremendous humility, and I was wondering whether it's a matter of faith, your experience in battling cancer, your family, or maybe all of the above.
It's probably a combination. Sometimes it's hard to express in words. Everyone has these choices that they make at somewhere along the way. And I guess when I was very young, I made a decision in my life that I would be a person of faith, and I know that in sports, people that talk about that often have it thrown back at them that they have feet of clay. Everybody has feet of clay, and everybody makes mistakes, and we all do that. But it has helped me through some very difficult situations and has also helped me appreciate some of the times that you were alluding to where people have seen fit to honor me, and those are all very wonderful. It does help you appreciate things, and it does help you with your strength when things don't go very well. But it is not necessarily a fail-safe in that everything that happens in your life is going to be perfect, because it doesn't work out that way. But it does, I think, give you some resiliency at times that are very difficult. I was in Portland, Maine with a right-winger that was one of the top guys in penalty minutes in our league. And he said, one time he talked about he and his wife went to church. And, you don't try to be judgmental about this, but you realize that here's a guy that fights on the ice and gets in all kinds of trouble. And yet that's another part of his life. And I said, gee, I didn't realize that. And he said, people don't want to hear you talk about that. They just want to see it. And if they see it, then maybe they recognize that that's the case. But there are so many empty words that can be spoken that can often not ring true. I don't want to sound like a preacher, because there are powerful people in sports that have different beliefs, whether it's the Muslim faith or the Jewish faith or the Christian faith or whatever else there might be. I'm only responding to the question in that has had something to do with my life, but there have been other aspects too. I've had a lot of people that have helped me along the way.
Doc, I've seen how you prepare, and I've seen the cards. You write a million things down, yeah, and it's got to stick in your head when you do it, because you can't find it, or can you, when you're doing a game?
Yeah, well, that's basically the reason for condensing it all down. I have, first of all, an 8x10 card that has a grid for keeping goals and assists and penalties and lineups on one side and is empty on the back. And the second thing that I have is something similar to what a lot of guys use in basketball, some in football, maybe in baseball, but I'm not sure. That most guys use a scorebook, and that is a numerical order 8.5 by 11 sheet that has a line down the middle on the short side, and then it's divided into horizontal squares. And I go in numerical order down the left side, beginning with the 2 goaltenders with a space for a third one if necessary. And then I begin in numerical order, beginning with the number 2 for the hockey players, and go in numerical order all the way down. And in large, usually color-coded to the team's colors, I'll put the last name and then the first name and then the position of the player, height, weight, birth date, and birthplace. And then any biographical data inside in much smaller print. So that way, there's not much time in hockey to look down if a player has the puck. But if play is stopped and Eddie Olczyk or Pierre Maguire are talking and there's still 3 or 4 seconds before a face-off, I'll have the opportunity to throw something in that I've either gotten from the dressing room or gotten from one of the printed media guides about the player to share just to fill 2 or 3 seconds before a face-off. And so that will be in front of me with the visiting team on the left of a spiral 3-ring binder, the home team on the right, and then that scorecard that I mentioned that has the goals and assists and the standings and all of those things that I've transferred over from the game notes so that I don't have to go rifling through 30 pages of notes when a guy scores a goal or when I need to know what place that team is in the standings. I've already converted it over to the front of my card. That card goes over the top of the 3-ring binder over the 2 lineups. So the card is there, the visiting team under the card to the left, the home team under the card to the right, and that's how I work.
I had to go and ask that when you talked about how you print, but I'm going to double back now to go back again to a thing that you've experienced, the battling cancer, and how much faith played a role in your handling that major problem.
Prostate cancer was what it was, Dick. It was in the fall of 1990, and the general practitioner where we lived in New Jersey knew that my family history, there were 2 maternal uncles who had it. And he did the 6-month check every 6 months, and he said, make sure you go and get an ultrasound. And he kept getting negative. And he said, go to a different lab this time. And I did, and it came back negative. And he said, okay, I want you to go to another one because I'm suspicious about something that I felt. So we were going to move from southern New Jersey to Hershey just because I like small towns, and my wife does too. So we went to Hershey Medical Center, and they said, gee, you drove 100 miles over here for an ultrasound? We might as well do a biopsy too. It doesn't hurt, only takes about 10, 15 minutes, and then you can go home. Well, I was sitting in the hotel in Montreal, and the phone rang, and it was the urologist at Hershey Medical Center, and he said, Michael, how are you? And I thought, how is that to start? And he explained that, sure enough, there's cancer. And, how do you, first of all, you don't call your wife on the phone and share that. You want to wait until you can actually sit down. And that was going to be 2 days later on Sunday after our Saturday night game in Montreal. And I hung up the phone, and I just said, Dear God, please get me through this. Didn't ask necessarily to be healed, but just get me through this. And Joyce was a rock. I sat down with her on Sunday, and then on Monday we went to Hahnemann Hospital, and they confirmed the diagnosis because by then they had the material in from Hershey Medical Center, and went on to Johns Hopkins and had the surgery and have been cancer-free for 25 years. But I think, in any stressful situation, I think faith helps you a great deal. It does not assure the outcome that you always want. In this case, it was the outcome that I got, that I really wanted. But the one thing that happens from something like that, I think people like myself will say 6 months after, every day is a blessing. And then after you get through 5 years, sometimes you forget that it even happened. And you realize that you're starting to take life for granted again. And every once in a while you have to kick yourself and focus again, saying, hey, you've gotten a gift here. God has given you a gift of extra time, and so you hope you can make the best of it, not only for yourself, but also for other people. I guess that's the role that it played, although it's a very long-winded answer, and I think you're probably running out of time, but I appreciate the question.
I've got to ask you, quickly, you don't have to go into much detail, your top moment, as a broadcaster.
Boy.
Doing hockey.
I've had a lot of chances to do a lot of things. I think probably one of the more recent was the gold medal game between the U.S. and Canada in Vancouver. It was the 2 North American countries. It was a tremendous impact on American audiences because their boys had gotten to the gold medal game against the originators of the sport in Canada. And it was the ultimate hockey game in that no one left. You pull the goaltender in the last minute. It's one of the most thrilling parts of a hockey game because it's the dangerous thing to do, and it might work, and it did. Zach Parise scored, tied the game for the U.S., and then Sidney Crosby scored in overtime and won it for Canada. Canada was the host nation, and so they won in overtime. And we had an interview with Sidney Crosby after and Ryan Miller, the losing goalie, after, and both of them were reflective of the hockey culture. They were generous, they were kind. They agreed to do an interview after it was very disappointing for Miller and very exhilarating for Crosby, and I think had the shoe been on the other foot and Crosby been on the losing team and Miller been on the winner, the interviews would have been just the same. It was one of the great days, I think, not because I got to call the winning goal, but because of what it said for hockey and how many people watched that game because it was the U.S. and Canada, and it was an important day for hockey.
In this year's Stanley Cup playoffs, last year, no teams from Canada made it, 5 this time.
Yeah, and some exciting players. Connor McDavid from Edmonton and Austin Matthews from Toronto are in it this year, and it's a chance to see not only those young guys that, in the case of McDavid, second year, in the case of Matthews, a rookie, get the excitement of playing for the Stanley Cup for the first time because it's a different kind of hockey. It's amazingly intense. And we talk about it a lot, but the players really sense it after they've played that first game. You can't tell them about it and have them really drink it in until they've played in the first game. It's thrilling for us to watch them and to talk to them after to see what they thought it was like. oftentimes they'll feel it was a lot more intense than they had guessed it was going to be. These guys are real gladiators at this time of year, and I think that's why it's so engrossing. And someone like Charles Barkley or Phil Jackson from basketball will say, yes, basketball is my sport, but I watch the Stanley Cup playoffs.
I know a lot of people who do, yours truly included, and my good friend Ernie Accorsi, who, by the way, grew up in Hershey, Pennsylvania, so he has an affinity for you, not only for the work you do.
Good for him. So he smelled chocolate 9 days out of 10.
Yeah, you know, it's a story that he's told me, Doc, you're going to enjoy. He was at Wake Forest riding in a car with fraternity brothers, and the radio was on, and they said, the lead story tonight is from Hershey, Pennsylvania. And he says, oh, my goodness, the chocolate factory burned down. Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points.
Oh, I know. And you talk to old-timers around there, and they all swear they were in the arena that night, and they couldn't have been.
That's true. Doc, what about, of all of it, you know, can you cite one guy, one player of all the greats you've seen?
It's tough because we have so many great gentlemen who were also extremely good players. If I had to pick one out of, you know, Gordie Howe is called by Bobby Orr and by Wayne Gretzky. Those three would be my top three gentlemen as well as players of all time. But I think if I had to pick a guy that I got to see a lot, it would be Orr. Not only because of how he is today, but I think how he revolutionized the sport. I think all three of those guys were very humble individuals, highly skilled people. I think the guy who epitomized the sport, as I grew up loving it most, was Howe, because he was skilled, he was rough. You never knew a tougher guy on the ice than Gordie Howe, but he was highly skilled, and he was such a panda bear whenever you were around him off the ice. It's just a wonderful sport with great people in it.
Yeah, prima donnas, no room for them in hockey, and you can tell that you don't have them in that sport.
They're not really celebrated. They're looked down upon. There's no pure celebration of being a jerk. They are only looked down upon, and so as a result, that attitude pretty well gets honed out of them rather quickly. In 44 years, I can probably count on one hand the number of people that I've met that really fit into that category. I don't know why, and it's not to cast aspersion on any other sport. It's just that the culture in hockey is very unique in that it's heavily family, and you see lots of parents, brothers, and sisters. Wherever a guy goes on the road and he plays near his hometown, he winds up buying a lot of tickets. There was a Philadelphia rookie named Dave Hoyta from Cherry Hill, Alberta. Freddie Shero was coaching the Flyers, and Dave went in for his first game in Edmonton. He bought 97 tickets, and the tickets aren't free. You pay for them. Freddie didn't know it was near his home, and he scratched him for the game. So Dave sat in the stands with his 97 family members that came out to watch him play. Otherwise, Freddie would have put him in because he was a tough guy, and the Flyers were never short on them.
That's wonderful. My penultimate question, any thoughts about the NHL stance concerning the Olympics?
Well, I'm disappointed that the best players can't represent the country, but I think from an NBC standpoint, people are going to watch the Olympics anyway, and I've had a chance to do Olympics for Turner and CBS and NBC, and all three had the main mantra, and you've heard this over and over too, Dick, that it's about telling stories about the athletes. There will be 23 really interesting stories about the men who will represent the United States. Will we miss the high caliber of athlete that has been going since 1998 in Nagano? We sure will. But it's the league's decision, and it was their decision to make. If I were an owner of the New York Islanders and I lost John Tavares for the rest of the season when I desperately needed him because he participated in the Olympics and I didn't get anything from that, I guess I would vote against going. But the other side of it is there will be 23 guys who are going to wear the colors of the United States, and there are going to be 23 wonderful stories to tell. So, it'll be fun anyway. And, of course, you remember back to a time when all the players were not NHL players. They were amateur guys, many of them out of college, and that was a magical time. Some people have wanted us to go back to that, and in a partial way, we're going to go back to that.
So true. Doc, can you put into words what your career has meant to you?
I've been lucky to get in free to a lot of games that I would have paid to see. And the first thing that intrigued me about a life calling hockey games was that I no longer had to pay. And you get a good seat for the game. You get to work now with the best athletes that play the sport. And later on, I learned after I started making $160 a week that you get paid nicely twice a month. I couldn't imagine it working out any better than it ever did. And to have a wife that understands that I go off to play, it's like a fraternity, though you don't have to go to class every fall. And that understands that you go off to play with the guys in the fall and that you come back and, we go to movies and we do things like that. But it becomes a different life for 9 months, and then in the summertime it becomes more of a normal life. And to have somebody that understands that it's very fortunate to have that indeed. So I'm very lucky.
Doc, I hope our listeners, if they're not true hockey fans, will get to watch one of the games you do, because it's a treat. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This has been a wonderful time for me to get a chance to talk to you even more, because in those days in Pittsburgh, I watched you all the time, and I admired you greatly for all the work you did. And those halcyon days of the NBA, as great a memory as a Hoosier kid that enjoyed basketball can ever have.
Doc, you're great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks again.
Yeah, it's good talking to you.
Now it's time for Taking Stock, where I offer my thoughts on a topic that's been in the sports news. Now, we all know Tony Romo retired from the Dallas Cowboys after much conjecture on whether he'd become a free agent or be traded. Where was Romo going to take his services after Dak Prescott had established himself as the Cowboys quarterback? So the oft-injured Romo hung him up and sided with CBS as their top expert analyst, teaming with Jim Nantz on the number one game on the network each week, and with the Thursday night package part of it as well. Romo is replacing Phil Simms, the longtime number one. Well, here's my take. I think Tony Romo will be an utter success at his new undertaking. He has an infectious personality, sense of humor, the most current knowledge of what's happening in the game, and he has played the most important position on the field. However, it's not going to happen this coming season, and it may take a few years for the real Romo to be a presence. And here's why. Breaking in, the job is not about how much football you know or what kind of personality you have. It's about how you learn the mechanics of being in a booth, what you say when, how you deal with observing a game from upstairs, not on the field, wearing a microphone headset, working with your partner, listening to a producer and a director in your ear. And by the way, they don't constantly talk when you're talking, contrary to popular opinion. And generally, feeling comfortable enough so that your comments and conversation appear seamless and not awkward. I know I have broken in virtually every one of the NFL experts on Fox, from Troy Aikman to John Lynch to Darryl Johnston to Rondé Barber and others, and I know what it takes. It takes time. Not from one game to another. You don't get better week to week. You really get better year to year. And Tony Romo will, I have no doubt, but he is breaking in, doing the best game on paper, going in every week. He won't be able to hide and work on his game. He'll be working the top contests, the best teams, and viewers will expect the best from the best. They don't come any better than Jim Nantz as his partner, but he can't do Romo's job. I think CBS should have let him ease into his new role. And let's not forget, with injuries to quarterbacks throughout the league, teams will be coming after him. That won't be easy either for Romo not to be tempted. It'll be interesting. So that does it for our episode of Stockton. Once again, I want to thank the great Doc Emrick for the conversation today. And also thanks to my producer, Peter Lyon, and our sound engineer, Greg Session. Stockton is produced by Collisions, the podcast division of CRN International. Collisions, podcast for curious people. I'm Dick Stockton. So long, everyone.